There was a time when healing was not about science, but about survival. When a fever wasn't just a symptom, it was a curse. When whispers replaced medicine, and every sickness had a spell. Back then, the line between a doctor and a witch was so thin that one wrong word could cost you your life. Tonight we're going back to that world, where the smell of herbs, smoke, and superstition filled the air, and the hands that tried to heal were often the ones most feared. But before we begin this strange and haunting journey through the history of medicine, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and like this video. It really helps more sleepy minds find stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And at what hour of the night are my words reaching you? There was a time in Europe when illness was not treated. It was judged. If you fell sick in the 13th or 14th century, people wouldn't ask what caused it. They'd ask what you did to deserve it. Medicine was tangled in religion, fear, and folklore. The church claimed the soul was more important than the body, and if you were suffering, maybe God wanted you to. So doctors were not healers. They were interpreters of divine punishment. In small towns, sickness spread quietly. The smell of rot from narrow streets, the buzz of flies, the coughs echoing from cold stone walls, all of it was seen not as disease, but as sin taking form. People whispered that bad air was God's anger, that a wound was punishment for greed, and that fever came from envy. And when pain got unbearable, when families had no one left to turn to, they went to the wise woman at the edge of town. She wasn't educated in universities or Latin, but she knew the land, its roots, its herbs, and its secrets. She'd crush leaves, mix powders, whisper prayers, and light candles, and somehow people got better. But that frightened the church, because if healing came from a woman's hands instead of holy prayer, what did that say about faith? So slowly, healing became heresy. If a woman knew too much about plants, she was suspicious. If she helped a sick child recover, people whispered she'd made a deal with the devil. And if she failed, if the child still died, they said she cursed it from the start. Imagine the fear of that time. To help someone could mean being dragged from your home at night, torches outside, faces shouting, "Witch!" You could spend years healing others, only to end up chained, cold, and alone in a dungeon, waiting for the flames. This wasn't rare. It was normal. In places like Germany, Scotland, and France, records show hundreds of women accused of witchcraft simply for practicing what we'd call medicine today. They used willow bark for pain relief, long before we knew it contained salicin, the chemical ancestor of aspirin. They used moldy bread on wounds, centuries before penicillin would make its name. But because their knowledge didn't come from books written by men in robes, it was branded as evil. Even physicians feared the accusation. A doctor could lose his position, his life, or his faith if he tried to explain sickness through natural causes. So they played it safe. They blamed humors, invisible fluids said to control every aspect of life. Black bile for depression, yellow bile for anger, phlegm for calm, blood for passion. If you were ill, they believed one of these was out of balance, and the cure, bloodletting, purging, or leeches. A doctor might arrive at your home, set down a candle, take a dull blade, and drain your veins, believing he was releasing evil spirits through the blood. Sometimes patients survived. Most times, they didn't. But families still paid, because at least they tried. At least someone had come in robes instead of rags. Meanwhile, the so-called witches healed quietly in forests, by moonlight, using what truly worked. They brewed tea from chamomile for fever, lavender for sleep, mint for digestion. They used garlic to fight infection, and honey to seal wounds. They read the wind, the weather, and the stars. And while the church feared them, the people needed them. There's an eerie beauty in that contradiction. A world where knowledge and danger were the same thing. Where to save a life, you had to risk your own. The true test of this strange and dangerous medicine came when Europe began to rot from within. It started quietly, an illness that slipped into towns like a shadow, unseen at first, then unstoppable. No one knew its name yet. No one could imagine that it would devour half a continent. Later, they would call it the Black Death. When the first cases appeared in 1347, people tried to pray it away. They carried crosses, burned incense, and locked their doors. But prayer could not stop the rats. The fleas clinging to their backs carried a silent curse, a tiny bacterium that turned human bodies into swollen, blackened graves. Within days, the strongest men were coughing blood. Within weeks, whole families lay stiff in their beds, the candles at their windows burning out one by one. Doctors had no clue. They dressed in bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, believing the sweet smell could block the bad air. They waved canes to keep patients away, terrified to touch them. And as death filled the streets, superstition replaced logic completely. People said it was the stars. Some said it was the Jews poisoning wells. Others said witches had unleashed hell upon the earth. Whatever the reason, someone had to be blamed, because the idea that nature itself could kill without meaning was too frightening to accept. So mobs turned their fear outward. They hunted midwives and herbalists. They accused neighbors. They tortured women into confessing that they'd brewed the plague in secret. The church blessed these punishments as holy cleansing, and while the pyres burned at night, rats scurried in the ashes, carrying the real killer from house to house. Inside the chaos, there were still healers trying to help. Some mixed vinegar with rose petals, believing it purified the air. Others carried posies of thyme and sage around their necks. A few desperate doctors even tried to cut open the buboes, those swollen lumps under the arms and between the legs, to drain the poison. It sometimes worked, for a while, but mostly death came anyway, silent and certain. And yet, amid that terror, something subtle changed in human thinking. For the first time, people began to suspect that maybe disease wasn't divine punishment or witchcraft at all. Maybe it was something natural, something invisible, moving from one body to another. That tiny spark of doubt was the seed of modern medicine, but it would take centuries to grow. Because after the plague faded, the fear stayed. It clung to Europe like a shadow. Every strange illness, every cough, every fever, people saw them through the lens of that trauma. Doctors kept using leeches. Priests kept blaming sin. And the healers, the ones who actually understood nature, kept hiding. In small villages, old women still gathered herbs by moonlight, still whispered to the earth before picking a root. They'd dry them by the fire, grind them into powders, store them in jars labeled only by memory. Their knowledge wasn't written anywhere. It lived inside them. And that made it even more dangerous, because if knowledge couldn't be controlled, the powerful feared it. Imagine sitting by a wooden table lit only by a single candle. Outside, winter wind rattles the shutters. Your child coughs, burning with fever. You've prayed, you've paid the priest, but nothing works. So in the dark, you walk to the edge of the forest and knock on a crooked door. A woman opens it, her hair silver, her hands smelling of earth. She doesn't ask your name. She only says, "Give me a moment." She takes a pouch from a shelf, drops a few crushed leaves into boiling water, and hands you the cup. You make your child drink it, and somehow the fever breaks by dawn. You never tell anyone, because if the neighbors find out, you both could die. This quiet exchange, repeated thousands of times across Europe, was how real medicine survived the darkness. Not in universities or cathedrals, but in kitchens, forests, and whispered secrets. Every remedy passed down became an act of rebellion. Every cure was a risk. And in that hidden world of healing, the boundary between doctor and witch blurred beyond recognition. As the centuries rolled on, these women became both myth and memory. In some tales, they were kindly midwives. In others, they were monsters with black cats and boiling cauldrons. But in truth, they were the keepers of human survival, preserving fragments of knowledge that science would later rediscover and name as its own. It's strange to think the same herbs once used in fear and secrecy, willow bark, foxglove, poppy, would one day be the foundation of aspirin, heart medicine, and morphine. The same witches burned for using them would, in another age, have been called pharmacists. But history has a cruel habit of honoring its dead heroes and forgetting its living victims. And so, as the Renaissance began to paint the world with light and learning again, the ashes of those women still blew quietly across Europe, reminders of an age when medicine was witchcraft, and witchcraft was simply medicine misunderstood. By the time Europe crawled out of the shadow of the plague, the world had changed, but fear still ruled medicine. People no longer spoke of witches as loudly, but the idea that healing was divine remained. The church had lost some control, yet its voice still echoed in every apothecary, in every dusty university hall where scholars whispered Latin and superstition in the same breath. In those rooms, lined with wooden shelves, stacked with jars of bones, dried frogs, and powdered metals, a new kind of healer was being born, the doctor of the Renaissance. He wore black robes, studied anatomy from forbidden books, and called himself a man of science. But his science was laced with mystery, arrogance, and fear. To understand the human body, he first had to open it, and that, until recently, had been a sin. Dissection was once forbidden by the church, seen as an insult to the dead and to God. But curiosity is stronger than commandments. So in secret, late at night, doctors began cutting into the cold flesh of criminals, thieves, and the poor. Their hands trembled not just from disgust, but from the fear that they might be caught by priests, or worse, haunted by the souls of the dead they dared to touch. Candles flickered over pale skin. The scent of rot mixed with the sharp sting of wine they poured to mask the smell. Every slice of the blade revealed not evil spirits, but something far more mysterious. Truth, veins, muscles, organs, all mapped not by magic, but by nature's own design. And yet, even as they saw the evidence before their eyes, many refused to let go of superstition completely. They called the heart the seat of the soul. They thought the liver produced passion, the spleen sadness, the brain only cooled the blood. Knowledge and myth shared the same body. The doctors of that era were both admired and feared. To the rich, they were saviors in velvet cloaks. To the poor, they were cold men who tested potions and powders on dying bodies. They spoke in languages no villager could understand, and when they visited a home, it often meant death was near. Still, they believed they were chosen. Men who could command life and death, who could drain pain through bloodletting, balance humors with mercury, and chase demons with smoke. They used what they knew, and when that failed, they invented explanations. One of the most terrifying was trepanation, drilling a hole in a patient's skull to let out evil vapors. Imagine lying on a table, no anesthesia, just the sound of a metal drill turning against your skull as the doctor murmured a prayer. Some survived, some didn't, and the ones who did were hailed as proof that the method worked. The human body, in those days, was less a person and more an experiment. Every pain was a puzzle, every wound a riddle from God. So doctors guessed, and the guesses often killed. They used arsenic to stimulate vitality. They prescribed mercury to purify the body. They gave opium to silence pain, not realizing how easily it could claim both mind and life. And yet, amid the madness, there were moments of genius. A man named Andreas Vesalius, in the 1500s, defied the church and created the first truly accurate book of human anatomy. He proved that Galen, the ancient Roman physician whose theories had ruled medicine for 1,000 years, was wrong. Vesalius showed that the human body was not designed for divine punishment, but for natural function. He was ridiculed, accused of blasphemy, and nearly executed, but his work changed everything. Still, progress came slowly. For every step towards science, fear dragged medicine 2 steps back. Doctors argued that fever was caused by bad blood. They believed disease floated in the air like invisible poison, clinging to poor neighborhoods as proof of sin. They wore rings filled with crushed emeralds to absorb toxins. They bled the sick until they fainted, believing weakness was a sign of recovery. The irony was cruel. The very people trusted to heal often brought more suffering than relief. But no one questioned them, because to question a doctor was to challenge God's chosen. And when their methods failed, there was always a familiar scapegoat, the witch. Even in the age of reason, women healers were still being hunted. In Germany alone, tens of thousands were executed between 1450 and 1650. Their crime? Owning herbs, caring for the sick, or knowing the names of plants that eased childbirth. Meanwhile, in universities, men in robes discussed the female disease, hysteria, and claimed it came from a wandering womb. Their cure? Frighten the woman, bleed her, or marry her off. Medicine had left witchcraft behind only in name. The cruelty remained. By the late 1600s, however, the whispers of true science began to grow louder. Microscopes revealed invisible worlds. Bodies became subjects of study, not shame. And slowly, painfully, the human mind began to trust evidence over faith. But the arrogance of doctors, that ancient echo of playing God, never disappeared. They had replaced witches and priests, yet they carried the same conviction that power over life must belong to them alone. And as the candlelight of the Renaissance turned to the dawn of the Enlightenment, new horrors would soon unfold in bright, sterile rooms, all in the name of progress. By the dawn of the 18th century, medicine had stepped into a strange new world, a world that looked brighter, but still reeked of ignorance beneath the perfume of discovery. Universities were flourishing. Anatomy theaters were packed with curious students. And for the first time in history, science had become a spectacle. In the great halls of London, Paris, and Amsterdam, people paid money to watch surgeons perform dissections on criminals. It was entertainment. The same crowd that once watched witches burn now gathered to see the inside of the human body. Flesh turned into theater. The air was thick with the smell of iron and decay. Surgeons sliced through muscle and bone with bare hands, their aprons stiff with blood. No gloves, no antiseptic, no understanding of germs. They believed pain was necessary for truth, and truth, they thought, justified everything. The doctors of this era were half scientists, half showmen. They carried themselves like magicians, commanding life and death with a blade. They competed to perform the fastest amputations, not the safest. A surgeon's fame depended on how many limbs he could remove before the patient screamed his last breath. There was one story whispered among the students of St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London about a man named Robert Liston. He was called the fastest knife in the West End. Liston once performed an amputation in under 30 seconds, an astonishing feat for the time. But speed had its cost. In one legendary operation, he accidentally sliced off his assistant's fingers and slashed through the coat of a spectator. The patient died of infection. The assistant died too. And the spectator died of fright. It became the only surgery in history with a 300% mortality rate. This was medicine at its proudest and most horrifying peak, an age that worshipped precision but ignored compassion. Hospitals were charnel houses where poor patients lay side by side, their cries echoing through damp stone walls. Operations were done on wooden tables stained black with dried blood. Instruments were rinsed in the same bowl of water used for the last patient. The word antiseptic hadn't even been invented yet, and still the doctors saw themselves as saviors. They believed pain purified the soul. They thought a patient's suffering was proof that the disease was being conquered. And when people died under their hands, they shrugged, saying God had chosen otherwise. But outside those cold operating rooms, quiet revolutions were taking place. In the fields, in the shadows, in the hearts of thinkers who saw beyond tradition. A man named William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood, proving that the heart was not a mystical furnace, but a pump. Antony van Leeuwenhoek peered into a drop of water and saw invisible creatures swimming there, the first glimpse of bacteria. For the first time, the invisible world that once belonged to superstition began to have names, shapes, and meaning. Still, progress met resistance. When Harvey published his findings, other physicians mocked him. They clung to the old beliefs, terrified to admit that centuries of medicine had been based on error, because to admit that was to accept guilt, the guilt of every life lost under false cures, every patient drained, poisoned, or burned in the name of healing. And yet slowly, truth crept in. By the late 18th century, a new obsession emerged: control. If doctors couldn't yet defeat disease, they could at least command it. They began to see patients not as people, but as puzzles, bodies to be studied, compared, and classified. Hospitals became laboratories. Suffering became data. And somewhere in that cold calculation, humanity was quietly forgotten. It was also the age of experimentation, some of it noble, some of it monstrous. They tested electrical shocks on corpses, trying to bring back the dead. They injected poisons, burned skin, and dissected animals while still alive, just to watch what would happen. One French doctor, fascinated by the power of nerves, connected frog legs to a battery and watched them twitch, believing he was glimpsing the secret of life. It was the birth of modern science, yes, but also the birth of moral blindness. And in that blindness, another dark truth emerged. Doctors had begun to take the place witches once held, not as victims, but as feared manipulators of nature. Where once people whispered of spells and curses, they now whispered of experiments gone wrong. Science had replaced magic, but the awe and the terror remained. In small towns, people still prayed instead of visiting hospitals. They still feared the surgeon's knife more than death itself, because to go under the blade was to surrender everything, to let another human decide your fate. Imagine lying on a table, wide awake, a wooden stick between your teeth to keep you from biting your tongue. You hear the saw begin. The doctor says, "Hold still," and you try not to scream as pain becomes light, then darkness. That was surgery before anesthesia. That was healing before mercy. It wasn't until 1846 that a dentist named William Morton demonstrated the first use of ether in surgery. The crowd gasped as a patient lay still, silent, and unflinching while his tumor was removed. For the first time, humanity had found a way to silence pain, and yet, even then, many doctors protested. They claimed that pain was necessary, that it was divine, that removing it was unnatural, because for centuries, suffering had been the only proof that a treatment was working. And so medicine entered another paradoxical age, one where knowledge grew but compassion lagged behind, where every cure was met with suspicion and every discovery was shadowed by arrogance. The line between healing and harm, between progress and pride, blurred once again. Doctors had stopped calling themselves priests, but they still behaved like gods, and as they reached deeper into the body, cutting, probing, experimenting, they began to believe that nothing in the human form was sacred anymore. It was this mindset that would soon lead to the darkest chapter yet, when hospitals turned into laboratories of horror, and the pursuit of science would cross every moral boundary imaginable. A time when the human body became not something to heal, but something to use. By the mid-18th century, medicine no longer whispered, it declared. The quiet superstition of the Middle Ages had given way to a new confidence, almost prideful, that man could master his own biology. But confidence left unchecked often grows into cruelty. Hospitals that once smelled of candle wax and prayers now echoed with clanging metal and footsteps over stone. Students crowded around wooden tables, notebooks open, waiting for their professors to reveal another truth of the body. And on those tables were the poor, the nameless, the forgotten, bodies purchased, stolen, or volunteered under desperation. For the wealthy, sickness had become a kind of fashion. They debated tonics and spas, blood purifiers and magnetism. But for the poor, the body itself became currency. A pauper's corpse might fetch enough money to feed a family for a week, if one was willing to sell it to the right surgeon. In London, grave robbers called resurrection men made a business of it. They prowled the cemeteries after midnight, digging shallow graves with muffled shovels, hauling bodies onto carts covered with burlap. Those corpses ended up beneath the knives of the city's finest anatomists, dissected by candlelight before wide-eyed students who took careful notes and felt no guilt. It was, after all, for science. The irony was heavy. While the church once forbade touching a corpse, now the law quietly allowed it, so long as the corpse belonged to someone too poor to protest. Bodies of criminals, beggars, and orphans became stepping stones toward medical fame. One such place was Edinburgh, where the thirst for anatomy outgrew the supply of legal bodies. Two Irishmen, Burke and Hare, saw an opportunity. Between 1827 and 1828, they murdered 16 people and sold the corpses to Dr. Robert Knox, a respected lecturer. Knox asked no questions. The cadavers were fresh, the lectures full, the applause loud. Only when neighbors noticed missing tenants did the truth surface. Burke was executed. Hare turned informant. Knox walked free and continued to teach. For the first time, the public began to ask a question that had been avoided for centuries. In the name of knowledge, how far should a doctor go? Yet even after Burke's noose tightened, the lesson faded. Elsewhere, new kinds of experiments began. Experiments not on the dead, but on the living. Physicians in France and Italy tested new poisons on prisoners, claiming to seek antidotes. They rubbed mercury into the skin of syphilitic patients, watching the gums blacken and the hair fall out, measuring the progress of decay as if it were a lecture note. In Vienna, midwives practiced on women of the slums, often delivering babies barehanded after tending corpses, spreading deadly fever from bed to bed without understanding why. It was during this grim era that Ignaz Semmelweis made his quiet, tragic discovery. He noticed that when doctors washed their hands in chlorinated water before touching patients, deaths from childbirth fever dropped dramatically. He begged his colleagues to do the same. They laughed. They called him mad. His insistence ruined his career, and he died in an asylum, ironically from infection. Years later, when germ theory proved him right, medicine called him a pioneer. But pioneers rarely live to see their vindication. For every Semmelweis, there were dozens more who treated human suffering as a ladder to personal glory. The age of experiment was a race. Who could uncover the next secret of life first? But no one asked who paid the price. In the colonies of Europe, doctors saw endless subjects. They tested new vaccines and drugs on enslaved Africans, on prisoners, on indigenous children in missionary schools. Reports called them field trials. Historians now call them atrocities. And yet those trials filled the journals of the Royal Societies, praised as progress. Through all this, the tone of medicine changed. The healer was gone. In his place stood the investigator, cold, brilliant, curious. The heart was no longer the seat of the soul, but a pump to be measured. Pain was no longer divine, merely data. And humanity itself became a kind of experiment, one conducted in the dim rooms of hospitals where no one outside cared to look. At the same time, something miraculous was happening. Within this cruelty, knowledge was blooming. Vaccination, anesthesia, sanitation, each born out of some mixture of compassion and callousness. Medicine, like fire, burned and illuminated at once. It saved lives, but it also revealed how easily mercy could be lost in the pursuit of mastery. As the 19th century deepened, that pursuit grew louder. Microscopes showed the wriggling armies of germs. Chemists isolated morphine and chloroform. Surgeons learned to stitch arteries and mend bones. But the belief that the ends justified the means only strengthened. Doctors began testing new anesthetics on themselves, on patients who never consented, on soldiers half conscious from war wounds. Pain was measured, catalogued, compared. They called it progress. And still, the echo of witchcraft lingered, not in cauldrons, but in laboratories. For just as witches once mixed potions in secret, doctors now mixed chemicals whose powers they barely understood. Their white coats replaced black cloaks. Their candles became gas lamps. But the mystery was the same, the eternal dangerous question: how much power over life should any human hold? That question would soon demand an answer in the darkest way possible, because the next century would bring a flood of knowledge and a tide of horror to match. A time when experiments would leave the hidden halls of hospitals and enter the wide stage of history itself. By the late 19th century, medicine had split into two phases. One was radiant with discovery: vaccines, anesthesia, antiseptics, microscopes. The other was shadowed, haunted by what it had done to get there. In many ways, humanity was healthier, but behind the curtain of hospitals and laboratories, ethics began to fade like an old photograph. In Paris, doctors experimented with hypnotism, claiming they could unlock hidden parts of the mind. At the Salpêtrière asylum, women labeled hysterics were paraded before audiences of students and journalists. They convulsed and wept on command, as if their pain was a theater performance. The famous neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot treated their suffering like a map of the human brain. But those women weren't patients, they were exhibits. And when they broke completely, they were quietly sent away, replaced by others. Meanwhile, in London, surgeons began to test painkillers and stimulants on anyone who'd agree or couldn't refuse. They administered chloroform to animals, prisoners, and even children, recording reactions with detached precision. If someone died, they called it an unfortunate reaction. If someone lived, it was data. Across the ocean, in America, medicine was marching toward its own dark frontier. In 1845, a physician named J. Marion Sims began experimenting on enslaved women in Alabama. He performed repeated surgeries without anesthesia, claiming they didn't feel pain the same way white women did. One of his subjects, a young woman named Anarcha, endured over 30 procedures. When Sims later moved to New York, he became celebrated, the father of modern gynecology. Statues were built in his honor. Only a century later did the world begin to whisper the truth, that his discoveries were written in agony. The idea of progress at any cost had fully taken root. It justified pain, erased guilt, and gave ambition a moral disguise. Scientists called it reason, but what it truly was hunger. And then came the new century, the 1900s. Electricity illuminated the world. Factories filled the air with smoke, and medicine became industrial. Pharmaceutical companies emerged. Hospitals became machines of healing and learning, with hundreds of beds and endless halls of glass jars, scalpels, and polished brass instruments. To the public, it looked like civilization at its peak. But beneath that sterile light, something colder grew, a belief that human life could be quantified, categorized, even perfected. In laboratories across Europe, doctors studied racial hygiene. They measured skulls, catalogued bloodlines, and spoke of purity as though it were a medical condition. By the 1930s, those ideas had found a home in the darkest heart of Germany. Under the banner of science, unspeakable things were done. Doctors in the Nazi regime performed surgeries and experiments that defied comprehension. They froze prisoners in icy water to study hypothermia. They infected them with diseases to test vaccines. They opened their veins to study shock, starved them to study metabolism. Every horror was wrapped in the language of research. Every act was noted, graphed, and filed away in neat handwriting. When the war ended, the world finally saw what progress without conscience looked like. The Nuremberg trials revealed pages of testimony that made even hardened soldiers turn pale. And from that horror came a new phrase that medicine had never truly honored before: informed consent. No longer could doctors claim ignorance or noble purpose as defense. From that moment, every patient had the right to say no. But history never stays still. Even after the Nuremberg Code, ethics remained a fragile thing. In the United States, for 40 years, the Tuskegee experiment allowed black men with syphilis to die untreated, so doctors could observe the natural course of the disease. They were told they were receiving free care. They were lied to. And by the time the truth came out, it was too late for most of them. When people learned of Tuskegee, it broke the illusion that such cruelty was a thing of the past. The line between healing and harm had not vanished. It had only changed shape. Now, it hid behind bureaucratic language and polished reports, behind research grants and experimental therapies. Still, within this darkness, light flickered. There were doctors who fought back, who refused to let science lose its soul. They demanded ethics boards, patient rights, and medical transparency. They taught that the purpose of medicine wasn't to control life, but to care for it. Slowly, compassion began to return to the operating table. And yet, something of the old spirit still lingers. Even today, when technology can rewrite genes or grow organs in a dish, the same question echoes through every lab, every hospital, every heart that holds a scalpel. Where does knowledge end and morality begin? Because the line between healer and experimenter has always been razor thin, and history shows us that once the human body becomes just another object of study, all it takes is curiosity, just a little too much curiosity, for that line to disappear. So the story of medicine isn't a straight path from darkness to light. It's a circle, one that begins and ends with the same fragile truth. To heal is sacred, but to forget compassion is to repeat every sin that came before. The dawn of the modern age arrived not with trumpets, but with quiet regret. Hospitals had grown brighter, cleaner, and more efficient, yet behind those sterile walls, the ghosts of medicine's past still whispered. They whispered of pain inflicted in the name of progress, of people forgotten for the sake of discovery. And somewhere deep in the human heart, the healers of the world began to ask themselves a question they had avoided for centuries. What does it truly mean to heal? It was the mid-20th century. The world had survived 2 wars that had rewritten its conscience. Science had taken humanity to the brink of destruction, and then brought it back with vaccines, antibiotics, and anesthesia. But every breakthrough seemed to carry a shadow behind it. For every disease cured, there was a story of someone who had suffered to make it possible. Medical schools began to change. Gone were the candlelit theaters where students once watched surgeries as if they were plays. Now, anatomy labs were filled with fluorescent light and quiet reverence. Bodies donated, not stolen. Students no longer saw their subjects as nameless vessels, but as gifts. The word ethics appeared more often in textbooks, written not as a warning, but as a compass. Still, the wounds of history didn't fade easily. In some communities, especially among those who had been exploited, the poor, the enslaved, the marginalized, trust in medicine had withered. Hospitals were seen not as places of safety, but as doors to something uncertain. Generations carried those fears in silence, and even as doctors tried to heal, they faced the legacy of their own profession's sins. In 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki was written, a code that echoed through every laboratory on Earth. It said that human welfare must always come before scientific interest. It said that every subject, every patient, every person mattered. For the first time in history, medicine had to look at itself and admit what it had done wrong. It wasn't just about saving lives anymore. It was about saving the soul of healing itself. But ethics, like medicine, is not perfect. Every decade brought new temptations, new questions that old rules couldn't answer. When technology began to advance faster than conscience, the old dilemma returned, wearing a modern face. Now, the experiments weren't about cutting flesh or testing poisons. They were about altering genes, cloning life, replacing organs grown in laboratories. Science had reached a point where humans could rewrite the very code of existence. And once again, the question whispered through the corridors of power. If we can do it, should we? Doctors and scientists debated. Politicians argued, philosophers wrote essays, and the world watched. Some saw miracles. Children born free from deadly diseases. People walking again thanks to bionic limbs. Hearts replaced without breaking the skin. Others saw danger. A world where human life could be designed, edited, even sold. There was a time when medicine fought darkness with candles and herbs. Now it fought the unknown with glowing screens and genetic sequences. But the fear beneath it all remained the same. The fear that one day, in the name of healing, humanity might lose what made it human. Even in modern hospitals, that fear sometimes flickers like an old candle. A surgeon's trembling hand before a risky operation. A scientist staring at a vial, knowing it could change the course of evolution. A doctor holding the weight of a patient's trust, knowing that every choice might alter a life forever. The tools may have changed. The heart of medicine never did. It still beats with the same fragile rhythm. Compassion versus curiosity. Faith versus fear. And yet, amidst all the technology, something beautiful happened. A quiet revolution. Doctors began to listen again. They looked beyond the charts and scans and started hearing what pain truly sounded like. Not just the physical pain, but the loneliness, the silence, the invisible ache that medicine could not measure. Palliative care, counseling, and empathy became as important as surgery and drugs. Hospitals built gardens where patients could sit in the sun. Medical schools taught not only anatomy, but humanity. In a way, healing had finally returned to its original purpose, not just to cure the body, but to comfort the soul. Still, the echoes of the past never vanish completely. Somewhere, deep within the vast archives of medicine, old notebooks lie hidden, filled with sketches, equations, and names of those who suffered for the sake of progress. And perhaps that's how it should be, because every page is a reminder that healing, no matter how advanced, is never free. It costs something. Sometimes it costs years of study, sometimes sleepless nights, and sometimes it costs the burden of remembering what others endured to bring light into the darkness. So when we talk about medicine today, its miracles, its machines, its wonders, we must remember that every heartbeat we save carries the faint echo of those who were once sacrificed. Not to glorify the past, but to honor it, to ensure it never repeats itself. Because medicine, in the end, is not just about science, it's about memory. And in remembering, we keep compassion alive. By the early 21st century, medicine had become almost unrecognizable compared to the blood-stained rooms of its past. Hospitals were filled with beeping monitors, glowing screens, and silent machines that could see inside the human body without ever breaking the skin. Diseases that once wiped out cities were now controlled by vaccines, antibiotics, and precision surgery. It looked like humanity had finally mastered the art of healing. But something strange began to happen. Amid all the success, doctors started to notice that people were still suffering, not just from illness, but from emptiness. Patients recovered physically, yet left the hospital feeling unseen, unheard, untouched by human warmth. Medicine had learned how to treat the body, but somehow had forgotten how to comfort the heart. So quietly, another kind of revolution began, not in laboratories or lecture halls, but in the small human moments that science had almost forgotten. Doctors began to spend an extra few minutes at a bedside. Nurses began to listen instead of just recording symptoms. Hospitals introduced soft music in recovery rooms, therapy dogs in children's wards, meditation spaces for staff and patients alike. It was as if the world had finally remembered that healing was never just about curing. It was about connection. The warmth of a hand, the calm tone of a reassuring voice, the feeling that, even in sickness, you are not alone. Modern research began to catch up with what ancient healers had always known, that the mind and body are not two separate worlds. Stress, grief, loneliness, these invisible wounds could slow recovery more than any infection. And compassion, empathy, and calm could sometimes do what no drug could. Hospitals started to change their design. Less like cold institutions, more like sanctuaries. Windows open to gardens instead of parking lots. Walls were painted in warm colors instead of sterile white. Doctors were trained to practice mindful medicine, to breathe before entering a patient's room, to leave their own stress behind for a moment, to see the person, not just the chart. And in that shift, something old came back to life, something that had once been buried beneath centuries of scalpels and superstition. The healer's soul. Some called it holistic medicine. Others called it spiritual care or human-centered healing. But whatever name it took, its heart was the same. Medicine was rediscovering its empathy. In ancient times, a village healer might have prayed over herbs or whispered blessings while tending a wound. Now, doctors and scientists began studying meditation, gratitude, and compassion with the same seriousness as surgery or pharmacology. Brain scans showed that kindness itself could change neural chemistry, lower heart rate, ease pain, and slowly, science began to prove what faith had always promised, that healing is not just physical, it's emotional, even spiritual. In the corridors of modern hospitals, there are stories that no data can measure. The child who survived because a nurse sang softly through the night. The elderly man who smiled for the first time in weeks because his doctor simply listened. The cancer patient who found peace, not through medicine, but through forgiveness. These are not the kinds of miracles that fill textbooks, but they are miracles all the same. And yet, even as medicine softened, a quiet unease remained. Technology was advancing faster than compassion could keep up. Artificial intelligence, gene editing, robotic surgeries, tools of the future that could heal faster than ever, but without a heartbeat. The new challenge wasn't ignorance anymore. It was distance. The more perfect medicine became, the less human it sometimes felt. A patient might speak to a screen instead of a person, receive results by email instead of eye contact. And though the machines were efficient, something sacred was quietly slipping away. The gentle human bond between healer and healed. That realization brought about the rise of a new movement, one that blended science with soul. Doctors began to study empathy not as a feeling, but as a skill. They learned that a single moment of connection could lower a patient's blood pressure, calm their breathing, even strengthen the immune system. Empathy, it turned out, wasn't soft science. It was powerful medicine. Medical schools began to teach narrative medicine, where students read poetry, study philosophy, and write about their experiences with patients. They were taught not just to diagnose, but to witness, to see the story behind the symptoms, to remember that every chart represents a life, a childhood, a memory, a dream interrupted by illness. Somewhere, perhaps without realizing it, medicine had circled back to its oldest truth, the one that existed long before microscopes or stethoscopes, back when healing was a sacred act shared between two human souls. Today, if you walk through a hospital late at night, you'll still hear the steady rhythm of monitors, the faint hum of machines keeping people alive. But listen closely, and beneath all that technology, you might catch something softer, a whisper of kindness, a laugh shared between nurse and patient, the rustle of someone adjusting a blanket just to make another person comfortable. That's where true healing still lives, in the small human gestures that no machine can ever replace. And maybe that's the lesson medicine had to travel centuries to learn. That knowledge alone isn't enough. That the most powerful cure has always been compassion. There comes a moment in every healer's life, whether they hold a scalpel, a stethoscope, or simply someone's trembling hand, when they realize that healing others has changed them too. It begins quietly, almost unnoticed, like a fatigue that sleep can't fix, the weight of hundreds of stories, the silent griefs they've witnessed, the countless faces that have faded from their memory but never truly left their heart. Medicine teaches how to save lives, but not always how to carry the burden of having done so. In the 21st century, this burden has a name: compassion fatigue. Doctors, nurses, and caregivers around the world began to feel the slow, invisible cost of constant empathy. They were surrounded by suffering but expected to stay calm. They were trained to heal pain but forbidden to show their own, and so many began to break quietly, not from failure, but from feeling too much. Hospitals, for all their brightness, became places where exhaustion whispered through every corridor. A young doctor staring at a monitor, wondering if they made the right decision. A nurse crying silently in a supply room before returning with a smile. A surgeon lying awake at night, replaying a moment they wish had gone differently. The world rarely sees this side of medicine, the emotional toll of those who must always be strong. But then something remarkable began to happen. The healers started to heal themselves. They began to speak openly about mental health, about the quiet loneliness that comes from carrying others' pain. Support groups formed, wellness programs appeared, and slowly the walls of silence began to crumble. Meditation rooms appeared in hospitals. Workshops on mindfulness and emotional resilience became part of medical training. Some institutions even brought in poets, monks, and philosophers, not to teach science, but to teach stillness. Because as it turns out, even the healers need healing. There's a beautiful irony in this. For centuries, medicine had tried to conquer nature, to fight decay, death, and imperfection. But in the end, it found wisdom in the same place it began, within the quiet rhythms of the human spirit. To heal others, one must also be whole. Imagine, for a moment, a late-night hospital hallway. The lights are dim, machines hum softly, and a tired doctor walks slowly toward the exit after a long shift. They pause by a window, watching the faint glow of the city below. Somewhere, in one of those thousands of homes, a life continues because of them. Someone is breathing easier. Someone's pain has lessened. Someone's heart is still beating. Because a stranger cared enough to help. That realization, though small, is what keeps medicine human. It's what brings balance to the endless struggle between science and soul. The healer realizes that they are part of something timeless, a circle that began with the earliest midwives and herbalists, and will continue long after machines become smarter and surgeries become invisible. In every generation, medicine has had to relearn humility. When it first discovered anatomy, it thought it had solved death. When it invented anesthesia, it thought it had conquered pain. When it built machines that could breathe for us, it thought it had outgrown nature. But every time it reached for perfection, something reminded it, softly, sometimes painfully, that perfection was never the goal. Compassion was, and so the modern healer's journey no longer ends at the edge of science. It circles inward, toward understanding, toward stillness. They learn that it's not weakness to cry beside a patient, nor failure to admit fear, nor unprofessional to pause and breathe. Because healing, at its deepest level, isn't about control. It's about connection to life, to others, to something greater than knowledge itself. When a surgeon takes a patient's hand before anesthesia, when a nurse hums an old tune while changing a dressing, when a doctor whispers, "You're going to be okay," that's not medicine in the scientific sense. That's medicine in the sacred sense. And that, perhaps, is what humanity was searching for all along. So as the circle closes, medicine finds itself where it began, at the intersection of mystery and mercy. The herbs and rituals are gone, replaced by scanners and algorithms. But the soul of healing remains the same. It still depends on faith. Not the faith of religion, but the quiet trust that passes between two people when one is in pain and the other promises to help. And if you listen closely, beneath the sound of monitors and machines, you can still hear it, the ancient heartbeat of compassion that began thousands of years ago when the first human tended to another's wound. That rhythm has never stopped. It beats still in every act of care, every gesture of kindness, every life saved, and every tear shed when one cannot be. That is where the story of medicine truly ends, not with perfection, but with presence, not with power, but with peace. Because healing, in the end, was never witchcraft, or science, or miracle. It was, and will always be, love made visible. As the centuries crept into the 18th and 19th, Europe and its colonies stood at the edge of revelation. Streets that once echoed with the prayers of frightened midwives now heard the footsteps of surgeons in stiff coats, carrying polished instruments instead of charms. Yet even with all the progress that gleamed in the gaslight, the human heart remained a trembling thing, still half convinced that illness was not merely biological, but moral. In candle-lit wards, doctors spoke of anatomy with a reverence once reserved for scripture. They mapped the body like explorers, charting forbidden continents, confident and terrified all at once. And behind the closed doors of universities, whispered debates flared between reason and faith. Could a scalpel truly replace a prayer? Could a tonic brewed from roots and mercury really outmatch the blessings of a priest? For many, it was easier to believe that both were needed, that somewhere between heaven and the hospital ward lay the true cure. The average patient of this era lived in two worlds. By day, they might visit the local apothecary, inhaling the sweet, dusty scent of ground herbs, while a learned man in spectacles measured powders on brass scales. But by night, that same patient might visit a hedge witch in the outskirts of town, asking her to whisper an incantation over a vial of rainwater. To them, the two cures did not cancel each other out. They completed each other. A body could be treated by science, but the soul still demanded its own medicine. Even the new doctors were not immune to the pull of old magic. Some kept lucky charms tucked into their coats, an ancient talisman, a pressed flower from their mother's garden, or a silver coin rubbed smooth by years of thumbprints. It wasn't something they'd admit to their colleagues, of course, but when a patient gasped for air, when blood refused to stop flowing, the surgeon's lips might move with a silent prayer. They would tell themselves it was habit, not belief, but deep down, both they and the patient felt that invisible thread between medicine and mystery. Hospitals, too, reflected this strange in-between age. On the outside, they appeared modern, brick buildings with iron railings, a sense of progress in their design. But inside, the air still smelled of candle wax and fear. Patients shared long, narrow wards, where the cries of the dying blended with the snores of the half-recovered. A crucifix hung over every bed, even in secular institutions, and while doctors debated bacteria and hygiene, nurses, often nuns or widows, would still sprinkle holy water in the corners of the room at dusk. It wasn't that people didn't believe in science. They did. But they believed in other things too. And when you're staring at the ceiling, feverish and uncertain if you'll see morning, you start to think that maybe both kinds of faith have their place, the kind that comes from the laboratory and the kind that comes from the heart. Even the textbooks of this era were haunted. Flip through a physician's manual from the 1830s, and between the pages filled with drawings of veins and organs, you'll sometimes find notes written in the margins, half formulas, half invocations. Let the patient not suffer. Mercy before precision. Words that read less like science and more like prayer. And so medicine evolved, but it never truly escaped the ghost of witchcraft. The potions became tinctures, the spells became prescriptions, and the charms became symbols of human hope. When a mother pressed her lips to her child's forehead after giving them a dose of quinine, was that not a spell of love? When a doctor promised recovery, though he knew the odds were slim, was that not magic of another sort? The line between healing and faith was not erased. It was rewritten. By the mid-19th century, the world stood in a strange balance. Telegraphs carried messages faster than wind. Factories roared with the birth of a new mechanical age. And yet, in the dim glow of hospitals, humanity still clung to whispers older than civilization itself. The doctors wore gloves now. The scalpels gleamed like silver under the gaslight. But illness remained a mystery that no microscope could fully explain. There was progress, yes. Theories were being tested. The word germ was slowly finding its way into medical vocabulary. But to many, the invisible still felt divine or demonic. When disease struck entire families, people still wondered, was this nature or was it punishment? In the countryside, midwives and herbalists continued their quiet rebellion against modern medicine. They didn't fight it with anger. They fought it with presence. They were there when the doctor wouldn't come, when a fever broke in the dead of night, when a child's breathing grew shallow. Their fingers mixed herbs with care. Their lips muttered prayers half remembered from grandmothers long gone. And when the patient recovered, villagers didn't thank science. They thanked the healer's touch, the whispered charm, the unseen hand that watched over them. Yet, in the cities, a different kind of healer was emerging. One who trusted glass and flame more than faith. These new physicians were determined to pull medicine out of the dark ages. They experimented on cadavers, studied anatomy in detail never seen before, and introduced sterilization techniques that would one day save millions. Still, they too were haunted, not by witches this time, but by conscience. For every success, there was a life lost in the pursuit of knowledge. Every advancement came with a shadow. Many of them wrote letters confessing sleepless nights, wondering if they had crossed some invisible line. "I cut into a man's flesh today," one surgeon wrote in 1841, "and though I did it for the sake of discovery, I could not shake the thought that I had trespassed where no mortal should tread." It was an era of paradox, where hospitals were both temples of healing and theaters of pain. Patients lay on iron beds, their bodies stitched and cleaned, but the air still thick with superstition. Candles burned not just for light, but for protection. Nurses whispered blessings as they changed dressings. Doctors rolled their eyes, and then, when no one was looking, whispered the same words under their breath. And beyond those hospital walls, people still feared the unseen. In London's narrow alleys and Paris's crowded quarters, strange illnesses rose and fell like tides. Cholera, smallpox, influenza, each one invisible, unstoppable, inexplicable. The poor said it was the wrath of God. The scholars said it was miasma, bad air carrying death on its breath. But deep down, everyone felt the same chill, that maybe, just maybe, something beyond science was still watching. But something had changed. Humanity, though afraid, no longer bowed before the darkness. It studied it. Every failed cure, every autopsy, every patient saved by a new technique chipped away at the myth. The world was learning that magic and medicine weren't enemies. They were ancestors and descendants. One had to walk so the other could run. By the late 19th century, as electricity began to hum through the veins of cities, the old ways were finally fading. The witches' huts grew silent. The charms were left to gather dust, and the language of healing became Latin instead of folklore. But though the age of witchcraft was ending, its spirit lingered, not in spellbooks, but in compassion, because when you stand at the bedside of someone suffering, When you offer comfort they can't quantify, that too is a kind of magic. It's not brewed or spoken, it's felt. And maybe that's why medicine, even now, is never truly cold. Beneath the sterile lights and white coats, there remains that ancient heartbeat of humanity, the same one that once pulsed in a healer's hands by firelight, whispering into the dark. By the time the 20th century began to stir awake, the world was no longer ruled by superstition, or so it thought. Streets buzzed with electricity, newspapers promised the triumph of reason, and doctors stood proudly as the new priests of the modern age. The scalpel had replaced the spell, and the laboratory had become the new cathedral of truth. Yet beneath the hum of progress, something ancient still stirred, that same old hunger to control life, to banish death, to play God. In the glittering hospitals of Europe and America, medicine had begun to look almost divine. White coats gleamed under gaslight, antiseptic scents filled the halls, and machines hummed softly like prayers made of metal. For the first time in history, people believed they might conquer death itself. But the closer humanity drew to mastery over the body, the more it lost sight of the soul. The doctors of this new age were both heroes and experimenters. They cured diseases that had haunted generations and created new terrors that no one could yet name. Vaccines saved millions, but in hidden corners of the medical world, experiments on the poor and voiceless became the price of progress. Prisoners, orphans, and the insane became test subjects in the pursuit of greater good. The scalpel no longer trembled in fear of divine punishment. It moved with the cold precision of curiosity. Hospitals became laboratories, and patients became data. And yet, even amid that coldness, something fragile survived. You could still find the nurse who held a trembling hand, the mother who whispered hope to her child, the old doctor who prayed quietly before surgery. Compassion, though buried beneath the weight of science, refused to die. Outside those sterile walls, people still struggled with the same fears their ancestors once whispered to witches. Why did this happen to me? Why does the medicine work for some and not for others? If God is kind, why does pain exist? And though doctors now spoke of cells, bacteria, and blood types, those questions still had no medical answer. The human heart remained a mystery no microscope could see. The world was changing fast. The First World War turned fields into open-air hospitals, where doctors learned to patch shattered bodies in minutes. Blood transfusions, antiseptics, and X-rays became miracles of steel and glass. But the horrors of war also revealed something medicine had long hidden, that healing and hurting were closer than anyone wanted to believe. The same hands that stitched wounds in daylight built weapons in the dark. After the wars came the golden age of discovery. Penicillin, anesthesia, and vaccines turned the tide against ancient enemies. Smallpox, once a death sentence, became a story for the past. And yet, each cure carried a shadow. Antibiotics saved millions, but their overuse birthed new resistances. Surgery became safer, but greed and vanity turned it into industry. Medicine was no longer a sacred act. It was a business, a power, a tool that could both save and enslave. In those years, the hospitals grew taller, the patients more numerous, and the silence deeper. You could walk through a modern ward, white walls, buzzing lights, perfectly folded sheets, and still feel the same chill that haunted the huts of old healers. The tools had changed, but the fear remained, the fear of uncertainty, the fear of not knowing what waits beneath the surface of the human body or the human soul. And so, in the gleaming world of modern medicine, witchcraft did not vanish. It merely changed its shape. The amulets became stethoscopes. The chants became diagnoses. The candles became fluorescent lights. But the essence, the belief that healing comes from something deeper than knowledge, that somehow endured. Because deep down, every healer still carries a spark of that old magic, that desperate, sacred wish to push back the darkness, even for one more breath, one more heartbeat, one more moment of mercy. As the modern age expanded its reach, medicine became both a blessing and a mirror, reflecting all that was noble and all that was monstrous in humankind. Laboratories filled with the quiet hum of machines, but behind those polished doors, choices were being made that would shape the moral heart of the century. In the name of progress, scientists began to chase perfection, to not just heal the sick, but to redesign life itself. They studied genetics, organs, and behavior with the same cold precision that alchemists once used when they stirred their potions by moonlight. The dream was no longer to banish disease. It was to build a better human. But every time man tried to play God, the price was heavy. In dim, secret rooms, experiments crossed the line between medicine and madness. Human trials without consent, injections without explanation, surgeries without anesthesia, all cloaked in the excuse of discovery. And when the world learned what had been done in the name of science, medicine itself trembled. The white coat, once a symbol of purity, became a reminder of how easily knowledge can turn cruel when detached from compassion. The world demanded a conscience. Ethics boards were born, laws were written, and the medical oath was rewritten to remember what had been forgotten, that the purpose of medicine was never power, but mercy, that healing without empathy is only another form of harm. And yet, as the dust of those revelations settled, a quieter revolution began, one that brought medicine closer to its heart again. And doctors began to see not just the body, but the human within it. Psychology emerged, understanding the invisible wounds that no scalpel could touch. The world learned that sometimes the pain that breaks us doesn't bleed. It hides, waiting to be heard. Technology advanced beyond imagination. Machines could now see inside the body, trace the flow of blood, even replace a failing heart. But the irony was undeniable. The more humanity understood the body, the less it seemed to understand the soul. The same society that cured disease struggled with loneliness, fear, and emptiness. Hospitals grew brighter, cleaner, and quieter, but also colder. In the corners of these sterile rooms, you could still find the ghost of the old ways. A grandmother whispering prayers beside a hospital bed, a doctor holding a dying patient's hand, a nurse humming softly as she adjusted a blanket. These were not scientific acts, but human ones, the kind of healing that no textbook could teach. For all its progress, modern medicine still lives in the shadow of its own history. A history built on both miracles and mistakes, on compassion and cruelty. And if you listen closely, under the steady beep of hospital monitors, you can almost hear it, the faint echo of a healer's chant, the whisper of a promise made by firelight centuries ago. You will not die tonight. Medicine has changed, yes, but it was never just about the body. It was about hope, fragile, stubborn, and eternal. From the witch with her herbs to the surgeon with his laser, that hope has been the same. A hand reaching out into the dark, trying, always trying, to pull another soul back toward the light. And that is the strange, quiet beauty of it all. That even after centuries of blood, fear, and trial, healing is still an act of faith. Whether it comes from a prayer, a potion, or a pill, the heart behind it remains the same. Because medicine was never born from science alone. It was born from love, and love, in its purest form, has always been the oldest magic there is. There is a strange comfort in realizing that every age, no matter how advanced or primitive, has shared the same quiet struggle, the desire to heal. From the shadowy corners of medieval huts to the sterile brilliance of modern hospitals, humanity has carried one simple wish: to ease suffering, to defy the darkness for just a little longer. We look back and laugh at the old ways, calling them superstition. Yet when sickness comes, when pain creeps in like fog at dusk, the old instincts return. We light candles beside hospital beds. We whisper prayers we thought we'd forgotten. We hold hands because deep down we still believe that warmth itself can heal. Maybe that's the secret that medicine, with all its microscopes and machines, will never outgrow. That healing is not a science, it's a relationship. It's the trembling hope between one heartbeat and the next. It's the moment when a doctor looks into the eyes of a patient and says, "You're not alone." No tablet or serum can replace that. No invention can bottle it. Because medicine may begin in the laboratory, but it ends in the soul. The story of healing is the story of us. Every era thought it was the first to understand, and every era discovered it was still learning. The witches of old mixed herbs not because they defied reason, but because they loved. The physicians of the Enlightenment dissected bodies not because they were cruel, but because they were desperate to save lives. Even the modern scientist, hidden behind gloves and glass, carries that same pulse of yearning to pull someone back from the edge, to make sense of the impossible. The faces change, the tools evolve, but the flame remains. And perhaps, if you listen carefully to the hum of a hospital at night, the soft rhythm of machines, the distant footsteps of nurses, the faint rustle of a turning page, you can hear it. The same heartbeat that once echoed in a forest hut, beside a flickering fire. The sound of someone trying to keep another alive. The sound of faith disguised as medicine. It is easy in the glow of technology to think that magic is gone, that science has replaced wonder. But the truth is gentler. The old magic never left. It simply found a new language. The herbs became chemistry. The chants became data. The potions became pills. But the intent, that silent, sacred wish for another person's pain to end, is still the same. And that wish, that act of love, is where real healing begins. We are still learning to balance what we know with what we feel. Still learning that not every cure can be measured, and not every recovery can be explained. Sometimes the body mends because of the right medicine. Sometimes it mends because someone cared enough to try. And when those two forces meet, science and compassion, something extraordinary happens. That is when medicine becomes more than knowledge. It becomes grace. So, as this story ends and the night deepens around you, think of how far we've come. From burning herbs under a moonlit sky to harnessing the code of life itself. Think of all the healers, named and nameless, who stood between suffering and salvation. And then think of yourself, alive in this moment, breathing, listening, safe. You are the continuation of that ancient story. You are proof that hope survives every century. And maybe that is the quiet lesson of it all. That even in our most scientific age, what truly saves us isn't only medicine, it's meaning, it's kindness, it's the unseen current that runs between all human hearts, binding us through fear, faith, and compassion. Medicine without that spirit is cold machinery, but medicine with love in it, that's alchemy. That's the oldest, truest witchcraft of all. So when you wake tomorrow and the world begins its noise again, remember this small truth. Every act of care, no matter how simple, is part of that same ancient miracle. Whether it's a doctor saving a life or a friend offering comfort, it all comes from the same place, the belief that light, even fragile, is worth keeping alive. And if this story brought you a little peace tonight, a little wonder, then let it remind you that history is not just written in wars or kings. It's written in every heartbeat that refused to stop. Now, before you drift into sleep, I want to thank you for sharing this quiet journey through time with me. If you felt something, calm, curiosity, or comfort, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story from the forgotten corners of history. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time of night is it for you? Because somewhere out there, across oceans and hours, another listener is doing the same, resting, breathing, and remembering that even in a world full of science, there's still a little room for magic. Good night.